The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October, tucked between a hydro bill and a flyer for a pizza place that had closed down 3 years ago. Everett Callahan almost missed it entirely. He was standing in the narrow hallway of his house in Sudbury, still wearing his work boots, still carrying the particular exhaustion that came from 11 hours of safety inspection work at the mine site. His daughter, Mara, was 7 years old and currently refusing to eat the pasta he had made before leaving for his shift that morning, which she had helpfully reheated herself and then deemed unacceptable by the time he walked through the door. "It's cold in the middle," she announced from the kitchen. "It's pasta, love. It's fine. Cold in the middle is not fine." He was about to explain, not for the first time, that reheated pasta had a complicated relationship with microwaves when he noticed the envelope, cream-colored, thick. The kind of paper that costs more than paper has any right to cost. His name was written across the front in handwriting he recognized before he even consciously remembered whose it was. Charlotte Weston. Everett set the rest of the mail down slowly. Mara appeared in the hallway doorway, still holding her fork. "What's that? Nothing." He said it too quickly, and she narrowed her eyes the way 7-year-olds do when adults are obviously lying. He opened it later, after Mara was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold before he touched it. The invitation was printed on heavy linen cardstock, gold embossed lettering, the kind of wedding invitation that announces a marriage the way a press release announces a merger. "Charlotte Weston and Griffith Aldcroft request the pleasure of your company at their wedding celebration at Chateau Fontaine, Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario." Beneath the printed text, in the same handwriting he recognized from the envelope, a short note had been added by hand. "I know this might seem strange, Everett, but I've thought about it and I genuinely hope you'll come. It would mean something to me to close that chapter properly. I hope life has been treating you and your little one well. Charlotte." Everett read the note twice. Then he set the card face down on the table and stared at the ceiling for a long time. 300 kilometers away, in a hotel suite overlooking Lake Ontario, Charlotte Weston sat cross-legged on an enormous bed while her best friend Jess painted her toenails and scrolled through Instagram simultaneously with the kind of coordination that came from years of practice. "Tell me again why you invited him," Jess said, not looking up. Charlotte examined the champagne in her glass. "Closure. You said that last time, when you deleted all his texts. That was also closure." "This is different," Jess finally looked up. "Is it?" Charlotte set the glass down on the nightstand. "He was living in that tiny house in Sudbury last I heard. Working shifts, raising that kid on his own." She paused. "I just think it'll be grounding, seeing where we both ended up." Jess stared at her best friend for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Charlotte, that is not closure. That is something else entirely." Charlotte smiled lightly and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. 4 years before the wedding invitation arrived, Everett Callahan and Charlotte Weston had been the kind of couple that people looked at and thought, "That'll work." They met during Charlotte's articling year at a firm in Sudbury. Everett was 31 and already working senior safety assessments for 3 mining operations across northern Ontario. He cooked well, he was reliable, he laughed easily and never made her feel guilty for working late because he understood work that demanded everything from you. What Charlotte wanted, though, kept changing shape. She grew up outside of Toronto, in one of those neighborhoods where the houses have names and the families who live in them have boards they sit on. Sudbury had been an adventure, a chapter, proof she could make it anywhere. But adventures have endings. When Griffith Aldcroft offered her a position at his family's corporate law firm in Toronto and took her to dinner at Canoe on their second date, and made it clear that the life he was proposing included a condo on King West and winter trips to Portugal, Charlotte made a decision. She made it carefully, and she made it quietly, and she did Everett the particular cruelty of making it seem sudden. "This isn't working," she had told him on a Sunday morning in March when the snow was still thick on the ground outside. "I'm not where I want to be, and I need to stop pretending I am." Everett had looked at her for a long time without speaking. "Is there someone else?" he asked finally. "That's not what this is about." He hadn't argued, he hadn't raised his voice or made it ugly. He had simply nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he's processing something enormous that he refuses to perform in front of an audience. Charlotte had expected more. She wasn't proud of that, but she'd expected tears or anger or at least the satisfaction of watching him understand what he was losing. Instead, Everett looked like a man quietly filing something away in a place where it would stay. She left Sudbury 6 weeks later. What Charlotte did not know, because Everett never told her, was that the last 3 months they were together, he had been working 18-hour days not because of ambition, but because she had mentioned once that her student loan repayment was affecting her ability to save. He transferred money into her account twice without her knowing, routed through a bill payment platform so it would read as an administrative deposit. He told himself he'd mention it someday. He never did. What Charlotte also did not know was that 2 weeks after she left, Everett received a phone call from a social worker in Thunder Bay. His younger sister, Dane, had died of a sudden cardiac event at 29. Dane had been raising her daughter, Mara, alone. There was no father in the picture. There was no one else. Mara was 3 years old. Everett drove to Thunder Bay the next morning. He signed whatever needed to be signed. He packed up Mara's room himself, methodically, carefully, taking her stuffed rabbit and her small stack of picture books and the drawings she had made and taped to the fridge that turned out to be a horse, though it was also possibly a dog. He drove back to Sudbury with Mara asleep in a car seat he'd bought at a Walmart on the way, and a grief so large he could not yet find the edges of it. He never called Charlotte to tell her any of this. He understood by then that calling Charlotte was not an option he had anymore. But sometimes in the first year, he would be doing something ordinary, unloading the dishwasher or reading Mara a bedtime story. And he would think about how the person he most wanted to tell about any given day was no longer someone he was allowed to call. He stopped thinking about that, eventually, or he got better at not noticing when it happened. By the time Charlotte's wedding invitation arrived, 4 years had passed. Mara was 7 and opinionated about pasta temperatures and absolutely convinced that the neighbor's cat was secretly a retired spy, a theory she updated weekly. Everett had been promoted twice. He sat on 2 regional safety committees and had recently been asked, quietly and through 4 levels of intermediary, whether he would consult on a federal review of northern mining safety protocols that the government was not quite ready to announce publicly. He told almost no one about any of it. He was not a man who led with credentials. He RSVP'd yes to the wedding. He wasn't sure, later, that he could explain exactly why. Some of it was Mara, who had never seen Niagara Falls and brought it up with the regularity of a legislative agenda item. Some of it was simpler than that. He wanted to see if he still felt anything, and he wanted to know the answer was no. The Chateau Fontaine looked exactly like its name suggested. Stone facade, manicured grounds, a view of the escarpment on one side and the manicured lanes of wine country on the other. Guests arrived in quiet European sedans and ride shares from the Niagara airport, moving through the lobby in the particular choreography of people who dressed carefully and arrived 15 minutes late on purpose. Everett arrived at 3:47 in the afternoon in a black SUV he didn't own. Mara sat beside him eating a granola bar and observing the arriving guests with the detached interest of a documentary filmmaker. "That lady has the same shoes as my teacher," she noted. "That's possible, but nicer, also possible, Daddy. Why are there 2 cars behind us?" Everett glanced in the mirror. A second and third vehicle had pulled in alongside them, dark, quiet, unremarkable. 2 men had already stepped out of each, scanning the entrance with the specific kind of attentiveness that most people in a wedding parking lot would not recognize for what it was. He didn't explain to Mara that 6 weeks earlier, he'd received a call from the security lead on the federal review project, informing him that 2 men connected to a mining lobby operation under criminal investigation had recently inquired about his schedule and movements. It was the kind of call that you take seriously even if you do not panic about it. Everett took it seriously. "They're just friends," he told Mara. She looked at him sideways. "They look like bodyguards. Eat your granola bar." They walked into the Chateau Fontaine together, Mara's small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers the way it always was in unfamiliar places. A coordinator near the entrance found their names on the list, hesitated for a fraction of a second at some internal note she'd been given, and then said pleasantly, and with only slightly overdone warmth, that Mr. Callahan would be at table 14. Table 14 was near the far edge of the room, close to the corridor where the kitchen staff moved trays of food back and forth between the preparation area and the main hall. Everett noted this without comment. Inside the reception hall, Charlotte moved through her own wedding like a woman managing a high-profile event. She was exceptional at it. Her gown was understated and beautiful. Griffith stood beside his groomsman, radiating the comfortable confidence of a man who had never really doubted that rooms would arrange themselves around him. Charlotte was greeting elderly relatives near the champagne station when she felt the specific change in the atmosphere of the room. Not a sound, not a disruption, just a subtle shift. The kind of thing that happens when a person with a particular presence enters a space. She turned without knowing why. Everett was crossing the room with Mara at his side. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, and he moved the way he had always moved, without announcement, without checking who was watching. But the men who had entered with him were now positioned near the room's exits, with the quiet precision of people who had done this many times before. and 3 separate guests near the entrance had already lowered their voices to speak to one another. Charlotte felt something cold slide through the space beneath her sternum. Not fear exactly. Something more like the feeling of standing in a room and realizing suddenly that you have been reading the temperature wrong. Griffith appeared at her elbow. "Who is that, Everett?" she said. "I told you about him." Griffith studied him across the room. "The one who worked the mines? Safety assessments, yes." Griffith made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Interesting security detail for a shift worker." Charlotte didn't answer. Across the room, old friends of Charlotte's from her articling year were gathered near the bar. One of them, a man named Dennis, who had gone in-house at a resource extraction company outside of Timmins, had gone very quiet. "Is that Everett Callahan?" he said to no one in particular. The woman beside him, another former colleague, looked up. "I think so. Why?" "You know him." Dennis set his glass down slowly. "I know of him, more recently. My company ran into his name twice in the last year. He's sitting on the Federal Safety Review Committee, the one that has 4 operations in the North under serious scrutiny right now." Another person in the group blinked. "That Everett Callahan is the guy Charlotte used to date?" Dennis kept his eyes on Everett across the room. "Small country," he said quietly. Griffith, meanwhile, had found his way to his business partner near the bar. "Tell me about that man Charlotte invited," he said more quietly than he intended. His partner, a corporate litigator named Sean, who had been watching the room with professional curiosity, answered without turning. "Which man?" "The one who arrived with the security team." Sean glanced across the room, then looked at Griffith with an expression that shifted almost imperceptibly. "Where did Charlotte know him from?" "They dated. Years ago. He worked in mining safety." "Worked?" Sean repeated carefully. "Past tense? What?" Sean pulled his phone from his inside jacket pocket and opened a browser with the unhurried focus of someone confirming something he already suspected. He handed the screen to Griffith without comment. Griffith read for several seconds. His expression did not change dramatically. He was the kind of man whose face was trained not to change dramatically, but his hand holding the phone stiffened slightly. The article was from a trade publication 14 months old. Northern Shield Consulting expands federal advisory contracts to include 3 provincial resource ministries. Founder Callahan cited as key architect of safety framework adopted in 4 provinces. Below it, a financial brief. Northern Shield Consulting, private estimated valuation 90M 140M, currently navigating acquisition discussions with 2 institutional partners. Griffith handed the phone back. He said nothing about this. Sean nodded slowly. "That does seem to be consistent with everything I'm reading." Everett, at this point, was watching Mara organize the complimentary place cards near their assigned table into what she described as a better system. "You can't rearrange those," he told her gently. "This one says Barrington, and this one says Fentworth. They clearly belong together." "Why?" Mara looked at him as though this should be obvious. "They rhyme. That is not how seating arrangements work. It should be." A woman at the adjacent table, a guest in her 60s who had been watching Mara with unconcealed delight, leaned slightly toward Everett. "She's wonderful," Everett smiled. "She is. She's also a logistical nightmare." The woman laughed. Then she said more carefully, "I couldn't help noticing. The men near the entrance. Are you?" She searched for a polite framing. "Just careful," he said. Not dismissive. Just final. The woman nodded and asked nothing further, but she said something to the man beside her when she thought Everett wasn't listening, and within 20 minutes, that particular dinner table had become the quietest and most attentive spot in the room. Charlotte found him during cocktail hour. She had planned this moment more precisely than she would ever admit. She had rehearsed what she was going to say. Something gracious and slightly superior, the particular tone of a person who has achieved what they wanted and wants the person who doubted them to know it. What she actually said when she reached him was, "You look different." Everett looked at her calmly. 4 years does that." Mara materialized from behind him immediately, examining Charlotte with frank, open curiosity. "Your flowers are really big." Charlotte looked down. "Thank you. Do you like them?" "They're a bit much, but in a good way." She tilted her head. "Daddy said you used to live in Sudbury." Charlotte kept her expression level. "I did for a while. We live in Sudbury. There's a science north there. Have you been?" "I haven't. You should go. There's a section about rocks." "Daddy knows everything about rocks." "Not everything," Everett said. "Almost everything." Mara asked she had completed the introduction portion of the interaction and wandered toward the appetizer table. Everett watched her go with the specific low-level attention of a parent who never fully stops tracking where their child is in a room. Charlotte watched his face while he watched Mara. That expression, she had forgotten it, or chosen to forget it. That completely uncomplicated softness. "She's your niece," Charlotte said. It wasn't a question. She had heard eventually through the complicated telegraph of mutual acquaintances that Everett's sister had died. She had thought then that she should call. She hadn't. "She's my daughter," Everett said, quietly but without ambiguity. Charlotte absorbed this. "You adopted her formally?" "Last year. She wanted to know if she could call me Dad officially. I told her she already had been for 3 years, but if she wanted the paperwork, we'd get the paperwork." Something moved through Charlotte's chest that she could not cleanly name. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she said. "When Dane, you'd already left." "I would have, Charlotte." His voice was not unkind, just honest. "You were already gone." The sentence landed with a particular weight because it was not accusatory. It was simply accurate, which was worse. Griffith appeared then, with the smoothly calibrated timing of a man who had decided that monitored conversations were preferable to unmonitored ones. He shook Everett's hand with aggressive warmth. "Everett, incredible that you came. Charlotte speaks highly of those years." Everett shook his hand. "Congratulations to you both. Exciting times." Griffith kept his grip a beat too long, the way some men do when they are deciding whether they are threatened. "I hear you're in consulting now?" "Something like that." "Industrial sector?" "Broadly." Griffith laughed the laugh of a man waiting for more information. Everett did not provide it. That silence became its own kind of statement, and Griffith eventually released his hand and pivoted to a nearby guest with the ease of a man who had been professionally pivoting his whole life. Charlotte remained. "He's not what I expected," she said quietly. Everett looked at her with mild curiosity. "What did you expect?" She didn't answer because the honest answer was, someone easier to feel better than. Dinner unfolded the way large formal dinners do, in stages, with the particular rhythm of speeches and courses and the kind of orchestrated sentiment that is genuine for some guests and performance for others. Everett ate quietly with Mara, who critiqued the appetizer, too fancy, approved of the bread, good, soft, good, and then fell into an earnest conversation with an elderly man 2 seats over about whether Canada geese were actually territorial or just commonly misunderstood. "They're just nervous," Mara told him. "People are scared of what they don't understand." The old man looked delighted. "Where did you hear that?" "I made it up, but I think it's true." Everett caught 3 separate people at nearby tables, watching Mara, with the slightly disbelieving amusement of people encountering a small child who speaks like someone who's been around longer than they have. He felt, as he often did in these moments, the particular pride that exists somewhere past language. The kind that does not need an audience. One of the guests who had been trying to get close to Everett all evening, a corporate developer named Randall, whose company was somewhere in the thicket of Griffith's investment portfolio, finally found his opening over dessert. "Northern Shield," Randall said, with the exaggerated casualness of a man very interested in something he is pretending to mention in passing. "You founded that from scratch? Grew it from a 2-person operation? In what, 3 years? 4? Randall nodded slowly. "There are people in this room tonight who would have loved to know that sooner." Everett glanced briefly toward Griffith's table across the room. "I imagine so." Mara looked between the 2 men with the serene disinterest of someone who has heard grown men talk about work many times and found it largely beneath comment. Then she leaned toward Everett and whispered, "Can we see the waterfall tomorrow?" "Niagara Falls?" "Yes, but the actual waterfall part. That is the actual waterfall part." "Okay." She went back to her panna cotta. "This is very good," she informed no one in particular. "Better than the pasta this week." Everett gave her a patient look. "We will revisit the pasta later. It was cold in the middle. We will revisit it later." The speech portion of the evening arrived. Griffith's best man delivered something polished and self-congratulatory by proxy. Charlotte's maid of honor, Jess, gave a speech that was warm and specific and ended on a genuine note that made half the room actually tear up, which Everett respected. Griffith's speech about Charlotte was smooth and eloquent and landed in all the right places. He was good at public moments, demonstrably. He knew how to make a room feel included. He referenced their first vacation together, their shared vision for the future, the particular way Charlotte laughed. Everett listened without expression. He had heard Charlotte laugh before, the real version, the one that was louder than she intended, and that she always covered with her hand a second too late. Griffith's description was accurate but assembled from the outside. He did not examine this thought closely. Charlotte came to find him on the terrace during the music portion of the evening. The Niagara escarpment was dark against the October sky, and the air had turned sharp the way it does in Ontario in October, cutting and clean and definitive. Mara was inside, watching the dancing from a safe perch near the dessert station, under the supervising eye of one of Everett's team, who she had apparently now recruited into a debate about whether the DJ should play more songs from the 80s. "I need to ask you something," Charlotte said. She had clearly been preparing this. Her voice had the controlled steadiness of a woman who had rehearsed the question but not the answer. Everett leaned against the stone railing. "All right, the men you brought. The security. That's not just professional cautions, is it? No. Is it connected to Griffith?" There was a pause. "The particular kind that contains more than silence. The federal review I'm involved in," Everett said carefully, "identified several investment operations in the North that have compliance concerns serious enough to warrant criminal investigation. One of those operations has significant overlap with Aldcroft Capital." Charlotte stared at him. "Griffith's family fund. I'm not the investigator, Charlotte. I provided technical safety data to a committee that includes federal regulators, the RCMP, and the Ministry of Natural Resources. What they do with that information is their process." "But you knew." Her voice was steady but thin. "When you got the invitation." Everett looked at her directly then, and for the first time that evening, something moved through his expression that was not composure. It was older than that. Something he had been carrying for a long time and had not intended to set down tonight. "I knew enough," he said. "I knew years ago that some of the people Griffith ran money through were connected to operations that were cutting corners in ways that put people underground in danger. I was working one of those sites when we were still together." Charlotte felt the ground shift very slightly beneath her. "That's why you were so stressed." "Yes, I thought you were just struggling." "I know," his voice was not bitter. "It was easier to let you think that. Why?" And she genuinely meant it, that particular desperate sincerity of someone who is revising a very long piece of memory in real time. Everett turned back to look at the dark line of the escarpment. "Because the alternative was telling you that people in your professional orbit were connected to things I couldn't prove yet, and watching you have to decide who to believe." The terrace was quiet for a long moment. Wind came off the escarpment. Somewhere inside, the DJ had apparently lost the debate about the 80s because a song Charlotte vaguely recognized from a decade ago was playing. "You were protecting me," she said, very quietly. Everett said nothing for a moment. "I was trying to, and you never thought to. You just let me walk away thinking you were, Charlotte." The gentleness in his voice was the hardest part. "You'd already decided. The rest was just logistics." She opened her mouth to argue this and then realized with the specific humiliation of a long-avoided truth arriving all at once that he was right. Inside the Chateau Fontaine, the mood had shifted. Several of Griffith's associates had received notifications on their phones within the last hour, and the energy around his table had been slowly contracting since dinner ended. The particular quiet of people waiting for something they already know is coming. At 9:14 p.m., a woman in a dark blazer entered the reception hall through the side door near the venue coordinator's office. She spoke briefly to the coordinator, showed a credential, and was directed across the room toward Griffith Aldcroft. Everett, watching from the terrace doorway, recognized the particular cadence of what was unfolding before Charlotte did. Mara appeared at his elbow. "Something's happening, yes? Is it bad?" Everett looked down at her. "Not for us." Mara thought about this. "Is it bad for the groom? That's above your clearance level." She accepted this with the equanimity of a child who has learned that some adult conversations resolve themselves without her input. Inside, Griffith was escorted with minimal disruption through a side corridor, away from the main reception floor, by two individuals who arrived in nondescript vehicles parked at the rear of the chateau. The formal statement from the RCMP Financial Crimes Division, issued publicly the following morning, outlined preliminary charges related to fraudulent investment practices, misappropriation of funds, and improper influence over regulatory filings. Most guests did not realize what had happened until they were checking their phones on the drive home. Charlotte remained on the terrace for a long time after Everett brought Mara back inside. The night was very cold and very clear, and the lights of Niagara were visible in the distance, that familiar permanent brightness. She stood there until one of the venue staff came to ask, gently, whether she needed anything. She said she was fine. She wasn't entirely sure whether that was true yet. Everett took Mara to Niagara Falls the following morning as promised. They stood at the railing at Horseshoe Falls, and Mara was silent for almost a full minute, which was unprecedented. Then she looked up at him with an expression of complete satisfaction. "Worth it," she said. Yeah. Can we get fudge? We can get fudge." She took his hand as they walked toward the market, the falls roaring behind them with the steady and indifferent enormity of things that don't require anyone's understanding to keep going. 3 months later, on a gray February afternoon in Sudbury, a message arrived through Charlotte's firm. Not addressed to Charlotte directly, but to her unmistakably through a formal property settlement intermediary. The matter related to a jointly held investment property she and Griffith had purchased before the arrest, now subject to asset review. Everett's name appeared in the documentation as a material witness in the regulatory proceeding, which was how Charlotte learned he had spent the past 14 months assembling the evidentiary record that eventually brought the case to warrant stage. She called him on a Wednesday. He answers on the second ring. "I read the filings," she said. "The public portions. Okay, you spent over a year on this. The committee did, Everett." A pause. "Yes," he said quietly. "I spent a long time on it, because of the men in danger at those sites, primarily. But also—" She stopped, restarted. "Did you know I was involved with Griffith when you started the review?" There was a longer pause this time, the kind that means the person on the other end is being precise. "I knew you worked at a firm connected to Aldcroft Capital," he said. "Yes." Charlotte sat very still in her office in Toronto. Through the window, a gray February sky pressed flat against the skyline. "You should have told me," she said. "Probably." He said it without argument, which meant he had thought about it, "but I wasn't sure you'd have believed me. And I wasn't sure it was my place anymore." The sentence landed the way honest sentences often do, with a weight that precedes any argument and makes argument feel beside the point. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said. "I need to say that, and I need you to know it's not about any of this. The trial or the money or—" She exhaled slowly. "I was young, and I was afraid that staying meant never having enough, and I took that out on someone who was only ever trying to make sure I was okay." The line was quiet for a moment. "I know," Everett said, and there was no anger in it. Just the particular exhausted kindness of a person who has already done the work of understanding something they did not deserve to have to understand. "How's Mara?" Charlotte said finally, because she needed to say something true and simple. "She's great. She's in a geology club at school. She gave a presentation on granite last week and corrected the teacher twice." Charlotte laughed before she meant to. It came out louder than she expected, and she covered her mouth a second too late. Everett heard it. He recognized it. He didn't say anything about it. "She sounds wonderful," Charlotte said when she'd composed herself. "She is," Everett said. "She really is." There was a comfortable pause, the kind that only happens between people who once knew each other well enough to not require constant words. "I hope things get sorted out," he said. "With the legal side of everything, it'll be complicated for a while." "I know. You're good at complicated." She wasn't sure if that was a compliment. She suspected it was, which felt like more than she deserved. "Take care of yourself, Everett. You too." She stayed on the call for a moment after she said goodbye, just listening to the ambient sound of wherever he was, the background sound of a house. Ordinary and ordinary and ordinary. Then the call ended, and Charlotte sat very still for a long time, in the quiet particular to people who finally understand exactly what they once had and cannot find a version of the past in which they made a different choice. Mara had drawn a picture of Niagara Falls that was taped to the fridge at the house in Sudbury. It was technically inaccurate in several respects, most significantly that she had included a whale in the river below the falls, which Everett had questioned gently. "There aren't whales in the Niagara River. There could be. There couldn't, actually. But if there were," she said firmly, "they would be very happy, because of all the water." He looked at the drawing for a long moment. "That's true," he agreed. "They would be.